Yeah, that's no problem. How many people here have heard the name Crispus Attucks before? Okay, almost everybody. And what do we know about Crispus Attucks? Anything in particular? First to die in the Revolutionary War. Very good, very good. And he's someone that most American school children today are introduced to in their introduction to the American Revolution. He's often identified just that way, as the first American to die in the cause of American liberty, or as the title of the presentation is here, First Martyr of Liberty. But he didn't show up in our educational system for many, many years. In fact, it wasn't until the 1960s that Attucks begins to show up in American history textbooks for elementary school and high school students, or even university level textbooks. So part of what interests me about Crispus Attucks is how he has sort of faded in and out of memory since his death in 1770, and the reasons why sometimes he's been forgotten, sometimes he's been made into a hero, and to raise questions about whether, how do we actually define who is a hero in American history? Here's a list of some famous names in American history from the early phases of American history, say before the Civil War. I'm thinking that most of you, all of you, will probably recognize these names. Okay, famous folks, and you could probably think of others. And here are some of the more well-known names of African Americans in that same period of American history before the Civil War. Some of these names are probably familiar to you. I would imagine that certainly Sojourner Truth, especially in this neck of the woods, with her home in Battle Creek not too far away. Harriet Tubman has gotten a lot of attention for her work in the Underground Railroad, helping slaves escape to freedom. Frederick Douglass similarly. Any names that are unfamiliar here? Yeah?
Unfortunately,
the first three. Phyllis Wheatley was a poet from the late 18th century, an African-American woman who was actually born in Africa, a slave in Boston, Massachusetts. A lot of people don't realize there actually were slaves in Massachusetts, not just the southern states. Benjamin Banneker was a free black man who was a mathematician, an astronomer, an inventor from Maryland around the same time period in the late 1800s. Gabriel and Nat Turner both led slave rebellions. Gabriel's did not actually take place. It was found out in advance and put down. David Walker was a pamphleteer and abolitionist and activist, as was Frederick Douglass and to a large degree Sojourner Truth. So these are some of the more well-known names, and I would include Crispus Attucks among those names. So I'm interested in the questions of how we identify certain people in history and how other names are forgotten or just left out of the story of what we're usually taught about American history. And these are some of my thoughts about what kind of characteristics or what kind of activities are involved in getting someone identified as a hero. So major discoveries like Columbus or Lewis and Clark, military victories, exhibiting courage and sacrifice and leadership, dying for a cause, patriotism. These are the kind of things that often translate into someone being identified as a hero. Now, who was Crispus Attucks? One of the things, we have to sort of look at Attucks in several ways in terms of what we can know about him and what we're not so sure about. We think that he was born around 1723, that he was of mixed African and Indian or Native American ancestry, and that he escaped from slavery in about 1750. And we think we know this because there's a piece of evidence of a runaway advertisement placed in a Massachusetts newspaper in 1750. Someone's slave had run away, and he put an ad in the paper to see if someone would find him and return him for a reward. And here we have William Brown of Framingham, Massachusetts, that's a town a little bit west of Boston, advertised that a mulatto fellow of about 27 years of age named Crispus, 6 feet 2 inches high, and then a further description of what he was wearing. He had escaped, and the advertiser was offering a reward of 10 pounds, which is a significant amount of money at the time, and warned that masters of vessels and others are hereby cautioned against concealing or carrying off said servant. So we know that there was a man named Crispus who was 27 years old in 1750, and he was a large man. He was 6 feet 2, which was extremely tall for that time period. A mulatto is a term that we don't really use anymore today. It's often considered offensive or at least insensitive, but it was commonly used in the 1700s and 1800s and for a good part of the 20th century, in fact, to refer to a person of mixed race. So here this runaway advertisement, the owner of this Crispus who's run away identifies him as a mulatto, so we are confident that he is a mixed race man, either a mix of African and Indian or perhaps African and English. We are pretty sure that after 1750, Crispus Attucks worked in the maritime trades, either as a sailor or working on the docks and in factories along the docks between New England and the Caribbean between 1750 and when he died in 1770. He may have been involved in some previous conflicts with British troops in that time period. There was a lot of tumultuous activity between the British troops and the workers in the American colonies. And he was almost certainly among the leaders of a mob that assaulted British sentries in 1770. And here's a quotation which you can't read, I can't read it, but I'll tell you what basically it says. Interestingly, in 1770, John Adams, the future president, was involved in defending the British soldiers at the Boston Massacre trial. I'll talk about that in a bit. Referred to Crispus Attucks, who was killed in that encounter, as, quote, an Attucks from Framingham, and he characterized Attucks as having undertaken to be the hero of the night and to lead this army with banners and march them up to King Street with their clubs. He described Attucks having the hardiness to fall upon the guard, and he took hold of the bayonet, with the other hand knocked the man down. This was the behavior of Attucks. According to John Adams, Attucks was the individual to whose mad behavior, in all probability, the dreadful carnage of that night is chiefly to be ascribed. So Attucks defending the British soldiers who killed, Adams defending the British soldiers who killed Attucks and several other men was trying to cast blame on Attucks, and specifically identifies him as an Attucks from Framingham. He was also, we do know that he was among the 5 who were killed in this Boston Massacre. Now, the Boston Massacre, I want to briefly just give some background to what was going on in Boston. I'll just sort of summarize some of this. Prior to 1770, as a lot of people are aware, there was increasing tension between the American colonists and the British Empire. Britain wanted to exert more control and extract more taxes from the colonies and play a larger role in governing the colonies. The Americans had gotten sort of used to being on their own and paying a very low level of taxes, and they didn't like this idea. So as the British try to impose taxes, there are protests in response, and Britain has to respond. And these are just a couple of the taxes that were passed in 1765 and 1767. Increasing tension until there was so much tension by the end of 1767 that the British sent a large squadron of troops to occupy Boston and to preserve the peace. So there were a couple thousand British soldiers in Boston after 1768, when the population of Boston was probably about 13 to 15,000. So it was a pretty significant presence of troops. And then in 1770, things sort of came to a head. In February, a number of Boston citizens were harassing a pro-British merchant who was not abiding by some of the non-importation agreements and boycotts that the colonists had set up. And a young man in this confrontation, a teenager called Christopher Sider, was killed by by a British supporter, not by troops. There was a big funeral procession and there was a big public outcry, and tensions sort of escalated from there. One of the things that British troops did in Boston, in addition to serving as sentries and guarding the customs house and other things like that, in their free time, they sought employment. They got outside work, and this was taking jobs away from American colonists. especially sailors and dock workers around the docks of Boston. And there were fights over this weekend, March 2nd and 3rd, Friday and Saturday, and on into Sunday. There were sort of constant brawls between British troops and some of the colonists until on March 5th, a Monday in 1770, there was a quarrel at the customs house in which some British soldiers got into a verbal exchange with some of the colonists, and a young boy who was there taunting the British soldiers was struck in the head with a rifle butt by the British, and this raised people's concerns, and they sort of started ringing the bells and called people to come to the square to confront the British. We'll get to Crispus in a minute here. So a mob forms, in fact a number of smaller mobs form, and they sort of converge on the custom house where there's this one sentry on duty. He calls for reinforcements, and they show up. Shots are fired. There's sort of a big mob situation here. Shots are fired, and 5 people are killed. Afterwards, there was a huge funeral procession for these massacre victims. The thing was immediately called the Boston Massacre. All these killed, there were 4 killed immediately and 1 died later, but the 4 who were killed immediately, including Crispus Attucks, were buried with great honor in a common grave in the old granary burying ground where lots of famous old Bostonians are still buried. Several months later there was a trial at which John Adams served as the defense attorney for these British soldiers who were charged with murder. Adams, as that quote indicated, blamed the mob, and Attucks in particular, for assaulting the soldiers and saying the soldiers fired in self-defense, and essentially the jury agreed. All of the soldiers were acquitted of murder. Only 2 were found guilty of manslaughter, and they were branded on the thumb and sent back to England. And now the massacre is often, as you said, that Attucks was the first to die in the American Revolution. And technically the revolution hadn't started yet in 1770. It didn't technically start until 1775 with the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and it really didn't become a war for independence until the Declaration of Independence in 1776. But the massacre was used even before then, from 1771 to 1783, the end of the war, to sort of stir up anti-British sentiment. They had, on March 5th, they had these annual commemorations where usually it would be a clergyman or some other prominent citizen giving a commemorative oration calling attention to these men who were killed and the sacrifice that they made. There was no reference to Crispus Attucks and identifying him as an African-American man or a man of mixed race or anything along those lines between the 1780s and the 1850s. He sort of disappears from public view. The massacre was occasionally mentioned in histories of the Revolution, but Attucks' role was really kind of erased. So I want to get to some images now to show the different ways in which the Boston Massacre was remembered or forgotten. And one thing I should emphasize about those commemorations that were held on every March 5th, these annual commemorations were really important propaganda events, as I've suggested, maintaining people's outrage against the British. Attucks was never singled out by name, but whenever they referred to these men who were killed, they would call them things like our countrymen, our fallen brethren, our fellow citizens. So all these people, including Attucks, were identified as citizens, as members of the community, as people who gave their lives in the cause of liberty. But the fact that Attucks was a person of color was ignored and very soon forgotten. So this is perhaps the most famous image showing the Boston Massacre. This is actually an engraving by Paul Revere, the famous man who made his Midnight Ride. He was also an accomplished silversmith and craftsman, and some people say he copied this image from somebody else and stole the publicity, but his name is attached to it. This is not an accurate illustration of the Boston Massacre. The mob was made up mostly of rough working men, young boys, apprentices, not the well-dressed sort of upper middle class people you see shown in this image. Also, the mob was really armed with rocks and clubs and big chunks of ice. It was March in Boston that they were assaulting the troops with. John Adams was quite correct that they were assaulting the troops, and the troops did fire in self-defense. The soldiers did not fire a planned, organized volley, as is shown here. When some of these people in the crowd started hitting their muskets with clubs or pushing them or hitting them with ice, one or two of these guys just up and fired, and that was basically it. It was not a planned attack, as is shown here. And also, again, it might not be easy to see here, but of all the people in the crowd, including those that are fallen, there's not a person of color shown in this image. All the people here appear to be white European descent colonists. So that's another part of the inaccuracy. Once again, Crispus Attucks is erased from this image. He is made invisible. The presence of people of color is made invisible. And Attucks remains invisible, as I said, for the better part of a century. And I should just say as an aside here, in terms of the presence of people of color, people of African descent in the colonies at this time. In the American colonies in the 1770s, 1 out of every 5 people was either born in Africa or of African descent. That was the level of the slave trade and the importation of slaves from Africa at that time, that 20% of the colonists throughout the whole 13 colonies were of African descent. Now, in a place like Boston in Massachusetts, it might have been only 3 or 4%. In a place like South Carolina, it was on the order of 65 or 70%. So 2/3 of the population of the colony of South Carolina was Africans. In Virginia, it was maybe 35%. And I think sometimes people lose sight of that in thinking about colonial and revolutionary America. They think of it as an English, primarily English colony, set of colonies, but there was a significant African presence here that is represented by Crispus Attucks. Now, I want to jump forward to the 1850s. This is another image of the Boston Massacre, which has some similarities with the first one, but there are some significant differences as well. And here Crispus Attucks is clearly depicted front and center in this image. Now, what happened in the interim between 1770, when Paul Revere's image was published, and this one in the 1850s? Well, in the 1830s, there were several popular books that were published. One by a person who was a veteran of the American Revolution, one that was a textbook about the history of the American Revolution, and one was a school book for young children about the American Revolution or American history in general. And all of these books in the 1830s identified Crispus Attucks as either a mulatto or a Negro or a person of color. And a couple of these books sold really well. So this information was beginning to get to a wider audience than people who may have been aware of that otherwise. The 1830s, when these books came out, was also a period when both growing numbers of both blacks and whites in American society were starting to agitate in a very organized way to abolish slavery. So the fact that these things are happening at the same time is significant. One of the African American abolitionists, a man named William C. Nell, who was from Boston, began researching Crispus Attucks as he became aware of Attucks' presence at this very sort of seminal event in American history. He starts researching Attucks, and he starts researching other blacks who fought in the Revolution. There were probably about 5,000 blacks who fought in the Revolution on the American side. So William Nell began to gather some more information, and it was Nell who used that term that I titled this presentation was the first martyr of liberty to identify Crispus Attucks, the first to give his life for American independence. So you can see here, you still have some of the inaccurate elements of the Revere drawing with the troops all in a line firing, but you do have Attucks holding a club in his right hand there that I think you can see. Whoops, didn't want to do that yet. Right there, you can see Attucks is holding a club, which is exactly what John Adams described and several witnesses in the trial described, grabbing the bayonet as Adams and witnesses from the trial described, and standing right in the front, and he was the first to die. Of course, we can't really verify this. Some of the descriptions here, and I'll quote from one of the books I mentioned, a book by an Italian historian named Carlo Botta, The History of the War of Independence, says, a band of populace led by a mulatto named Attucks, who brandished their clubs and pelted the soldiers with snowballs. The mulatto lifted his arm against Captain Preston, and having turned one of the muskets, he seized the bayonet in his left hand as if to execute his threat. So this is the way Attucks is depicted. William C. Nell, following up his research on Attucks and other revolutionary veterans, published a book in 1855 called Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, which was both a piece of abolitionist propaganda and a good work of history documenting the wartime experiences of a number of African Americans. And here is an image from Nell's book, which again, somewhat different from Botta's, but again shows a very clearly dark-skinned man here, represented by Crispus Attucks, and the caption does identify him as the first martyr of the American Revolution. So by the 1850s, Attucks has become this important symbol. William Nell was really instrumental in this. He was a very important person in terms of doing black history at a time when not many people were interested in black history. William Nell's books and speeches about Attucks spread through the abolitionist community, and Attucks quickly became a household name, at least within those circles of anti-slavery activists. He became their #1 symbol in their arguments for abolishing slavery and also for granting full citizenship rights for African Americans. Because he was the first to die in the cause for independence, Attucks was the perfect symbol for black patriotism, loyalty to the country, bravery, sacrifice, and citizenship. And they used him very effectively in this way. However, not all the attention to Attucks was positive. Here's another image. This actually is from one of the books. It was initially published in the early 1830s. This was the School Book for Children by Samuel Goodrich. It went through numerous editions through the 1830s, 40s, and this is an image from the 1851 edition. And the caption of this picture, in which you see very clearly a black man here, Attucks, similar to the other one, he's sort of grabbing the arm of the soldier, holding a club up over his head. So it's similar to that other image, but the text about it is different. Hey, the text about it is different because here the caption says, "People attacking the soldiers." And moreover, he goes on to really blame the crowd and absolve the soldiers from firing on the crowd. As far as this author was concerned, and many others at the time, Attucks was not a hero. He was a rabble-rouser and a troublemaker. This illustration was in a very popular children's book, and with that caption, the author in the text says that a noisy crowd rushed furiously upon the British soldiers, led on by a giant of a Negro named Attucks. They brandished their clubs and pelted the soldiers with snowballs, abused them with all manner of harsh words, shouted in their faces, surrounded them, and challenged them to fire. At last, Attucks, with 12 of his men, began to strike upon their muskets with clubs. Attucks lifted his arm against Captain Preston and seized upon a bayonet. At this instant, the firing began, and the Negro dropped dead upon the ground. So, similar image to the other one in some ways, but a very different story that's built around that. In that previous image, the intent here is to show Attucks standing up bravely to the British soldiers and standing up for American liberty, whereas in the school book picture, here Attucks is presented as a troublemaker who basically got what he deserved, along with the others. Now, Attucks did receive a lot of attention in abolitionist newspapers and speeches, and as a symbol of black American citizenship. This is a broadside, a flyer advertising a commemoration, basically celebrating Crispus Attucks Day. This is from 1863, this particular one, held at Tremont Temple in Boston, a major gathering place for lectures and things like that. Between 1858 and about the mid-1870s, Boston abolitionists held annual Crispus Attucks Day commemorations on March 5th. And in addition, African Americans around this time, because of fears of being recaptured and taken back into slavery, or free blacks being captured and sent into slavery in the South, blacks in the 1850s in communities in the North formed militia companies, basically military companies that were armed, they drilled, they were prepared to defend their communities. And several of these militia companies named themselves after Crispus Attucks because of his martial valor. There was the Attucks Blues in Cincinnati, the Attucks Guards in New York City, and there were several others. These commemorations were the kind of events that brought Crispus Attucks' name in the 1850s from being completely erased from the story to being a really central part of the lead up to the American Revolution and a symbol for black citizenship. But many whites remained either unaware of Attucks or they chose to ignore him. And this is an image from 1868, well after Crispus Attucks was a well-known figure, showing up in numerous textbooks and other places. But this is another one of those Boston Massacre images that shows no people of color involved at all, whether from the author's ignorance or from a conscious effort to erase and change the historical record is hard to say. Eventually, a monument was built to Crispus Attucks and the other massacre martyrs on the Boston Common, right along Fremont Street, a very prominent location. William C. Nell had tried to get the Massachusetts legislature to erect a monument to Crispus Attucks in 1851, but they basically shot him down with the argument that he was simply a troublemaker, not worthy of commemoration. But here in the 1880s, things changed. There was widespread support, after the Civil War, after the abolition of slavery. In the North, there was a widespread support for honoring this African American man and the others who fell with him, both among blacks and whites. Many black and white dignitaries participated in the dedication and unveiling of the monument, and the poet John Boyle O'Reilly read a poem about the massacre that's quite famous. Some of it's etched on the sides of this monument, saying, "Honor to Crispus Attucks, who was the leader and voice that day, the first to defy, the first to die, with Maverick, Carr, and Gray," the three other men who fell that day. "Call it riot or revolution, or mob or crowd as you may, such deaths have been seeds of nations, such lives shall be honored for aye." So, despite the monument's successful erection here, members of the elite Massachusetts Historical Society objected that Attucks was, quote, "not a fit candidate for monumental honors, since the famous mulatto was a rowdyish person, killed while engaging in a defiance of law." So still, you have this sort of mixed record on Crispus Attucks. Is he an American hero? Is he symbolic of African Americans' rights to citizenship because of their participation in this seminal event of the Revolution? Or was he just a rowdyish person who was making trouble and got into this mob and got shot because of it? That is the debate that sort of went on. Among whites, by the start of the 20th century, white America had come once again to ignore Crispus Attucks entirely. He did not appear in textbooks at all after the 1880s, even those that mention the Boston Massacre. But African Americans kept his name alive in numerous ways. And this is a cover sheet for some sheet music. And if you look at the bottom there, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Down at the bottom here, this is the logo, which I blew up from this little part in the corner. It's the Gotham Attucks Music Company. It was a music publishing company run by African Americans in New York City that took the name the Gotham Attucks Company to honor him. Census records and military records show numerous African American men named after Attucks. There was Crispus Attucks Walker and Crispus Attucks Palmer, who were both drafted to serve in World War I. The latter person's son, Crispus Attucks Palmer Jr., enlisted and died fighting in World War II, and there are quite a few other examples from this time period. Another example is the Attucks Theater in Norfolk, Virginia, built in 1919, and on the you can see this faraway view. It shows us the stage curtain has an image of the Boston Massacre, and this is a view of the Attucks Theater from around the 1920s. Today, that's still a functioning building. It's been restored, and it is now the home of the Crispus Attucks Cultural Center in Norfolk. Other similar kinds of ways of honoring Attucks include, there were Attucks hotels in both Atlantic City and Philadelphia in the early 20th century. There were Crispus Attucks community centers in Brooklyn and Greenwich, Connecticut, and there was the Crispus Attucks Old Folks Home, they actually called it that then, the Crispus Attucks Old Folks Home in St. Paul, Minnesota. So in various ways, African Americans tried to keep the memory of Attucks alive. Some of you might be aware that not too far down the road in Indianapolis, there is Crispus Attucks High School, which actually created a big stir in the 1950s when they won the state basketball championship with Oscar Robertson as one of their stars. This was built in 1927. Crispus Attucks, she may well have. She may well have. Merce Tate, very well-known WMU alum, and quite an exceptional woman. I think you need to have more research on. But yeah, so Crispus Attucks High School was the segregated black high school in Indianapolis. I think it's still there as a middle school or technical school today. They changed it back to a regular high school? Okay. Oh, I see. Very good. Okay. So again, the high school, and they have a museum there as well. I understand there's been a big renovation in the past few years. And there's a museum there and this commemorative marker in front. There are also Attucks schools. They're all over the country. East St. Louis, Missouri, Wyandotte, Kansas. Many other places have Attucks schools, one place or another. There are many other types of community institutions named for Attucks, including boys' clubs, housing projects, parks, choirs, political clubs, and not surprisingly, because Attucks' death came in something of a military conflict, many Black American Legion posts were named the Crispus Attucks Post, including one in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the one depicted here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. This is a photo from 1940 showing the band playing at Crispus Attucks Post number 59, and you can see on the see on the drum there, it has Crispus Attucks Post written on the drum head. So there are all kinds of ways that Attucks was memorialized. And blacks in Boston began to revitalize the Crispus Attucks Day celebrations in the 1930s, and in fact got white support to the extent that the governor of Massachusetts in 1932 declared Crispus Attucks Day an official state holiday, and it was commemorated annually ever since. And I think it's significant that it wasn't called Boston Massacre Day. It was specifically called Crispus Attucks Day. So acknowledging this African-American man's presence. And it's really interesting, you know, that poem I read an excerpt from, John Boyle O'Reilly, mentioned Maverick and Caldwell and Gray, the other three men who who died that day. But we don't remember their names. And we don't remember them for a very good reason. It's that Crispus Attucks' name was used for a cause. He was used in the cause of anti-slavery activism in the 1800s and the cause of advocating for full civil rights. And you can see this, you know, this is the main thing I've been studying about Attucks, is how he's been remembered, how he's been characterized in different time periods. And there's a real clear pattern of when you see an increase in attention to Crispus Attucks in particular, and it's often around American wars. Around the Civil War, there was a lot of attention to Attucks. It seems that every war America's involved with, this question comes up about whether African Americans, among whites, whether African Americans are capable of being effective military combatants in a war. And among African Americans, there's often a question of whether we really should be fighting in this war for a country that has been denying us our rights for generation after generation. But in terms of demonstrating blacks' capabilities in a military capacity, Crispus Attucks' name came up during the Civil War, during World War I, and even more so during World War II, when there was an increasingly significant battle to end segregation in the military and end discrimination in American society as a whole. The World War II era was a really important buildup for the modern civil rights movement in many, many ways, more complicated than I could go into here. But it was really after World War II that you begin to see Attucks getting more attention in the broader society. So it really should be no surprise that things did begin to change in the post-war period during the civil rights movement, where African Americans began to take a more prominent place in Americans' minds than at any time since the Civil War and Reconstruction era. White Americans, because of the activism, the Montgomery bus boycott, the school desegregation movements, Little Rock, the sit-ins, all of this stuff is forcing white Americans who previously could be pretty complacent and not really have to think about African Americans, now had African Americans, especially with television, coming into their homes every day, and these battles for equal treatment in the South and for the end to brutalization in the South was increasingly on people's agendas. And you begin to see changes in school books. And what I have here is the cover of a textbook that's a fairly modern textbook, but it's an example of the fact that Crispus Attucks now, down here, you can see his picture along with a number of other individuals showing up on the cover of a textbook. He did not show up in textbooks between the 1880s and the 1960s, but in 1964 you began to see, you saw, it's the first textbook that I have found, high school level textbook, that includes Crispus Attucks and describes him as part of the Boston Massacre and treats him as an American hero. And increasingly through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, he became more and more of a presence. And you know, you think about how we form our ideas about American history. In the public schools, you get an introduction to heroes. And when no African Americans are mentioned as heroes or as significant factors in American society, there's no reason for young people who are coming of age and forming their ideas about this country to appreciate the role that blacks have played from the beginning of this country's founding through the present. But as they start to show up in school books, at least it starts to open the doors a little bit to a little bit broader understanding. There are a number of ways after the 1960s that Crispus Attucks, whoop, that can't be the end of the show. I have more. All right, something went wrong. Yeah, here we go. Okay, let's try this with I don't know why I wanted to end my show. Okay, here's what I'll do. I'll let you see the slide view. Okay, doesn't show up quite as well, but there is a we're on the bicentennial, and some of you might be familiar with the, well, we're now in Black History Month. Black History Month started as Negro History Week in the 1920s. One of the founders of the study of African American history, Carter G. Woodson, established Negro History Week in 1926. 50 years later, in 1976, it was expanded to Black History Month. And during the bicentennial, there was all kinds of attention to, especially in the post-civil rights era, all kinds of attention to African Americans' contributions, including the Jim Beam Bourbon Company, who put out a series of commemorative 100 proof flasks of bourbon, including this one honoring Crispus Attucks, with his image there and a little story on the other side of the Boston Massacre. In the 60s and through the present, there are numerous biographies, especially juvenile biographies of Crispus Attucks and historical fiction about Crispus Attucks. And he also showed up in this book in the lower left, The African American Soldier, not a juvenile book, but a story, sort of a popular history of African Americans in the military, and the subtitle is From Crispus Attucks to Colin Powell. It was put out in the 90s, I believe, or early 2000s. but especially the ones geared for young audiences, these little mini biographies, sometimes piece together totally fabricated pictures of Attucks' life where we really can know very little about him. In the 1990s, there was a punk rock band from the Baltimore area that called itself Crispus Attucks. These three high school students got together and named their band Crispus Attucks because of his rebellion against repressive authority. And the lower album cover there, that you can't read the subtitle, the album is called Destroy the Teacher. So they're doing their own rebellion against repressive authority. In 1998, there was a coin, again using Attucks' image, even though we have no idea what he looks like, of course, but these images sort of show up, and it's interesting sort of figuring out where they come from. This is a coin honoring African American veterans of the Revolutionary War. 1998 happens to be based on what we think we know, the 275th anniversary of Crispus Attucks' birth in 1723. So they put Attucks' image, or their suggestion of his image, on the cover. Currently, there are other ways that Crispus Attucks is honored. The Crispus Attucks Tea Party is a group of African Americans, and I'm not sure where they're founded, but you can find their website, who are in line with the sort of ideological, political perspectives of the Tea Party movement, identify themselves as the Crispus Attucks Tea Party to show that, yes, there are black people who share these values, and using Crispus Attucks as a symbol. And this one on the top, the Crispus Attucks Brigade, this is a group of folks who are involved in the Minuteman movement, people who are patrolling our southern borders to stem the tide of illegal immigration, and wanting to sometimes use violent means. Well, there's a group of African Americans involved in that movement calling themselves the Crispus Attucks Brigade. So America for the Americans in this case. The bottom one is the label from Crispus Attucks Homebrew Company. A microbrewer has various kinds of beers honoring African Americans, in addition to Crispus Attucks Sexual Chocolate Stout. There is the Crispus Attucks These Nuts Brown Ale, and the Crispus Attucks Brooklyn Massacre IPA. So Crispus Attucks' name lives on in places where you might not necessarily expect to find his name living on. They have lots of other names as well. That's the end of the presentation.